Coming up next, it's 90s Looney Tunes on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Batman the Brave and the Bold on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Ben 10.
Coming up next, it's Ben 10 on Cartoon Network.
Ben 10. Towing Forces coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Ben 10 Line Force on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the Ultimate on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Buster's Hunt for Imaginary Friends on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Buster's Movie House of Blues on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Buster's Movie Destination Imagination on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, the Prospector's Incident on Cartoon Network.
Chowder coming up next. Coming up next, it's Chowder on Cartoon Network.
Total Drama's Line is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Total Drama's Land on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Total Drama Action on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the all new Totally Surprise on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Kurt the Cowardly Dog on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, Very Cowardly Dog on Network.
Coming up next, it's Banking and Battle Brothers on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Zad and Eddie on Cartoon Network.
The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack on Cartoon.
Up next, it's Garfield on Cartoon Network.
George of the Jungle is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's George of the Jungle on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Garfield on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the premiere of Goosebumps. Welcome to Jayhouse on Cartoon.
Coming up next, it's the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Jeffy on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's a all-new Coda on Cartoon Network.
Up next, it's a Superhero Squad show on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Mike and Partners on Monkey on Cartoon Network.
Tom and Jerry are coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Instant Jerry on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry Blast Off to Mars on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry and the Bus and the Brain on Cartoon Network.
Charlie Test is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Johnny Test on Cartoon Network. Coming up next,
Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's
coming up next, it's Countdown on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the Mr. Men Show on Cartoon Network.
Naruto's coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Naruto on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Cartoon Kids Next Door on Cartoon Network.
Pokemon Diamond and Pearl Battle Dimension is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Oakman Diamond and Pure Battle Dimension on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Pokemon Movie 10 of the Rise of Darkrai.
Coming up next, it's Pokemon on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Pokemon Diamond and Pearl Sonic Battles on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Generation Rex on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Mucha Lucha on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Teen Titans on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Robotoid on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Robotoid on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Witch Ghost on Cartoon Network.
What's New Scooby-Doo is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo, where are you?
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo's Randy Night on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo the Witch Ghost on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Alien Invaders on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Monster of Mexico on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo of Pirates Ahoy on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's What's New Scooby-Doo on Cartoon Network. It's
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Where Are You in Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo on Cartoon Network.
Scooby is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's the League of Super Evil on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, Star Wars: The Clone Wars on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's You Got Files on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's a whole new deal. Mine's on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the Secret Saturdays on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the new episode of The Secret Saturdays on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, Hot Wheels Battle Force 5 on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Batman Mystery of the Batwoman on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Casper Scare School on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, the Fun Fest on Cartoon Network.
coming up next. It's a little break on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Mystery Weekends on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Ninjas Trouble and Tickle on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Open Season on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Adventures of Babs City on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Scary Godmother Toby Revenge of Jimmy, Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Cartoon Kids Next on Cartoon Network.
Pokemon Fever Movies coming up next.
Coming up next, the Billy and Mandy and the Fish Files on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Kangaroo Gayose on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry Shiver Me Whiskers on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Garfield Gets Real on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Hi Hi Papa and Ewing on Cartoon Network.
Up next, it's the Little Johnny Test on Cartoon Network.
The new episode of Postman is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Billy and Mandy under suspicion.
Coming up next, it's the all-new Ghostbumps on Cartoon Network.
Pokemon is coming up next.